Text Talks.
Hello, and welcome to
Text Talks. I'm Alex,
and I'm Katie.
and today I'm going to be talking about Buddhism in the West. So, before I begin, it's important to note that I'm going to just go through one strand of transmission of Buddhism into the West. There are lots of different ways in which Buddhism has arrived to, the UK, to America, Australia, countries that are considered Western today. And so what I'm saying is relevant, but it's not the whole story. But if you do want a bigger picture of the whole story, a really great book to look at is How the Swans Came to the Lake by Rick Fields. And that book covers everything from ancient India's interactions with like ancient Greece and people like Alexander the Great. Did you know that all Buddhist statues originated because of a synthesis between Buddhism and Alexandrian society?
Wow.
You do now. So it covers everything from that through to, contemporary Buddhism today and people like the 14th Dalai Lama, influences from, the hippie movement, everything like that. And it covers it chapter by chapter. So it's a really great book if you want to read about literally how Buddhism came to the West, but it also talks about, migrants from China coming to America, different centers of Buddhism that around those different groups of people that arrived in different countries, in the 1800s and so on.
So a light summer read.
Oh, just a bit. It's not like it's 500 pages long, but you can dip in and out of it. It's got a really good glossary index, and so you can find your way if you're particularly interested in Zen Buddhism. You can find that narrative, that line through the book.
And that definitely is the way to approach academic books. If you ever, get really interested in a book and then you get it and you're like, this is so big and it's so wordy and it's quite intimidating, like, absolutely, we get that. But yeah, a lot of the time academics will come in and out of chapters, in and out of sections, so don't be afraid to do that.
Yeah, and it's the perfect book to do that. So, How the Swans Came to the Lake has a bigger picture. But today I'm going to talk about this very particular strand, and that strand is mostly from Western scholars and thinkers taking their interpretations of Buddhism, and we're kind of going to see how these people's interpretation of Buddhism back in the late 1900s has really impacted how we view Buddhism today. Why is Buddhism viewed as more scientific than other religions? Why is sometimes Buddhism is viewed as a way of life as opposed to a religion? All of these kind of ideas that we have about Buddhism today can be found in its history and about who promoted it and how they promoted it and why they chose to do it like that. So, we're going to start off in 1875 with the Theosophical Society. Now, the Theosophical Society was a esoteric group set up by a woman named Madame Blavatsky and a man named Henry Olcott. And what the Theosophical Society attempted to do was take ancient traditions from all over the world. They were particularly interested in Egyptian mythology, in Indian mythology, and all of these different groups, and create a one overarching religion that encompassed all of these teachings from all around the world. And they did this through the notion of the Ancient Ones. Now, the Ancient Ones were a group of enlightened beings, let's say, who have, impacted the world and how we view religion and spirituality. So, an enlightened one was Jesus. Sorry, an ancient one was Jesus. Another ancient one was Buddha. And so you can see from this that Buddhism is already starting to be brought into the West as part of an amalgamation of other traditions around the world. We won't go too much into the fact that Madame Blavatsky believed that she could telepathically communicate with these ancient ones across time. We don't have time for that. So it had this, really eclectic introduction to the West in this line of transmission that we're following. And Henry Olcott, who I'll come back to later, was also really important for Buddhism in Sri Lanka. And the next key date for you is 1893, and this is the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. And this is maybe for some of you who've also studied Hinduism, this is the same World Parliament of Religions that Vivekananda spoke at. And at this World Parliament of Religions, we have two key Buddhist monks. One is Angarika Dharmapala, and one is Soyen Shaku. Now, Angarika Dharmapala was also from Sri Lanka, and so him and Sir Henry Olcott had a relationship, and actually Angarika Dharmapala's legacy is now Bodh Gaya. You know, the point where Buddha became enlightened, that place?
Oh, yeah.
Well, in the early 1900s, that temple had been retaken over by Hindus. And Angarika Dharmapala spent his life's work trying to reclaim it for Buddhists, to claim the spot of enlightenment for Buddhists. And he managed it. Unfortunately, he passed away before it happened, but Henry Olcott saw this through, and eventually Bodh Gaya has now been reclaimed as a Buddhist holy site. And then you've got Soyen Shaku, who was a Zen monk from Japan. And both of these monks, as well as Vivekananda from Hinduism, were very particular in how they portrayed their traditions to the West. You imagine you go into an audience and you're going to do a speech. You kind of want to talk in a language that audience will be receptive to, right?
Of course, yeah. You always alter what you say to make sure it's actually going to be interesting to the people listening.
Yes, and what was very popular in the 1900s, it was the Enlightenment. So it was talking about things in terms of science. Mm-hmm. And so that is how Angarika Dharmapala and Soyen Shaku talked about Buddhism. They, were saying that it's not like Christianity. It's more scientific, it's more real, it's more... And that is how they portrayed it. And, we can kind of see their legacy today, even just from that small, fact.
Well, I was going to say that a lot at the time in the West, when you talk about Buddhism, it's like, oh yeah, but it's not as religious or spiritual. It's it's kind of grounded in environmentalism and that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Right? There's this kind of almost like trying to make it sound more logical.
Precisely, and a lot of the seeds of that were sown by the World Parliament of Religions and the speakers at the World Parliament of Religions. And I'm going to be doing a podcast on Buddhism and science next week, so you'll be able to hear all about it in a bit more detail there. But what's important to note here is these two speakers were at the World Parliament of Religions and portraying Buddhism in this way. And sat in the audience was a man called Paul Carus. Now, Paul Carus's main motivation was to kind of have interfaith dialogues, and specifically interfaith dialogues based around the notion of science or scientific disciplines. And Soyen Shaku from Japan and Paul Carus kind of hit it off. And Soyen actually said to Carus that, well, you need some Japanese text translating. I've got a student who knows English and could come over and work with you. And that student was D.T. Suzuki. Now, Suzuki is possibly one of the most famous Buddhists in the West, behind, the likes of Thich Nhat Hanh and the Dalai Lama. And his impact on Buddhism has been huge because he has talked about Zen Buddhism and written prolifically about it. And again, he was following Soyen Shaku's trajectory and example of talking about Buddhism as if it's not quite a religion, as if it's this something better. I mean, there's arguments in the academic community that he also tied in a lot of Japanese nationalism to his work. But D.T. Suzuki got what a Western audience wanted from Buddhism and helped tailor Buddhism for that audience. It wasn't the West dictating what was going to happen with Buddhism, but it was Suzuki being clever enough to realize that this is a way to get your tradition out there onto the mass market. And that's what he did. And some of the most famous group of people that he inspired was the Beat Generation. So the Beat Generation was a big in the 50s. It was all about spontaneity and creativity, and DT Suzuki inspired the Beat Generation through their kind of warped view of Zen.
So Beat Generation, is that kind of like hippies?
This is pre-hippie.
Right,
So
okay.
the Beat Generation, if you're ever interested in the hippie movement, look at the Beat Generation first. The Beat Generation laid the foundations for the hippie movement in a lot of ways. And you've got people like Allen Ginsberg, who was a famous poet. You've got Gary Schneider, who has now become a very famous Buddhist and environmentalist. And you've got writers like Jack Kerouac, who is is probably one of the most well-known Beat Generation writers. And he wrote a book about called Dharma Bums, that's about
Dharma as in...
Yeah, as in the Buddhist Dharma, and it's about backpack Buddhists. And he has this vision of, in the 50s, of Buddhists being these guys just walking around with not very many possessions, just traveling and experiencing life, because that is the impression of Zen Buddhism that they'd received from DT Suzuki. Like I say, it's all about this spontaneity because of sudden enlightenment and things like that, the ability to become enlightened at any point. Therefore, everything is the chance to become enlightened. So you should engage in reality. And that's what this group really portrayed.
There's another book recommendation then in this podcast.
Yes. Dharma Bums. But just be very aware the context that it came out in, and that it's not necessarily what all Zen Buddhists think. The Beat Generation is a great example of, you have to be hyper aware of historical situations before then engaging with, what type of religion.
Yeah, this is a Western book inspired by...
Yes. Yeah. And, inspired by DT Suzuki, who knew what he was doing in portraying Buddhism in such a way, because it got popular. Following the Beat Generation, and actually the next thinker features in Dharma Bums, under a different name, under a pseudonym, is a thinker called Alan Watts. Now, Watts was most prolific in the 50s and 60s, and he brought together traditions of Taoism, of Zen, and he lectured all around the US. And he was very influential in, again, promoting this idea of Zen as being spontaneous, and therefore we should just act how we want to. And of portraying Buddhism in terms of scientific discourse as matching science at the time. Following Watts, or in line with Watts, is also then the hippie movement, the New Age movement, and all of these things that have come since. These are covered in How the Swans Came to the Lake, and it's really interesting because Fields talks about how Zen appealed to the American mindset of the 50s, whereas Tibetan Buddhism was more influential in the 60s. You think Tibetan Buddhism, with all its bright colours and so on, had more of a sway in particularly American Buddhism in the 60s because of the hippie movement than Zen did. So it's very interesting to realise that Buddhism isn't just even this one thing. We see the rise and fall of different Buddhisms depending on what the audience wants. So that's kind of a brief history of Buddhism in the West. And like I say, that's only one line of transmission. But what does that mean today? What is Buddhism today? Now, some scholars like the term, and some don't, of Buddhist modernism. And a scholar called David McMahon states that by Buddhist modernism, I do not mean all Buddhism that happens to exist in the modern era, but rather forms of Buddhism that have emerged out of an engagement with the dominant cultural and intellectual forces of modernity. So what he means by this is Buddhist modernism isn't, these traditional temples that still exist in Myanmar or in Japan or somewhere like that. They are Buddhism that exists in the modern era. But Buddhist modernism is a hybrid tradition that has taken parts of Western culture or Western thought and been merged with Buddhism to create something quite distinctly new. So some of the main influences in Buddhist modernism are movements like American Transcendentalism, German Romanticism, ecology, and and modern scientific ideas. And that means that when we look at Buddhist modernism, we kind of get this type of Buddhism that's both scientific and spiritual. It's environmentally conscious. It's more focused on this world than achieving enlightenment. It's non-hierarchical. There tends to be no leader in Buddhist modernism. It's, Buddhist modernism's the sort of person who has a book on their nightstand and reads it and then meditates in the morning. There's no leader there. There's no student teacher. And the other massive part of Buddhist modernism is that it's commodified. So people make money out of Buddhist modernism. You think of, we've talked about in other podcasts, mindfulness colouring books, buying into courses, going on retreats.
Lots of Buddha head statues in gardens.
So many Buddha head statues. So that's all part of Buddhist modernism, because commodification is one of the dominant cultural factors we have today in the West. We're a capitalist culture. And so Buddhism has been adapted to fit that, even though traditionally it's a tradition where you shouldn't have anything. It's about non-attachment. But
that's so interesting.
Yeah. So Buddhist modernism has created a type of Buddhism, or if we agree with the term Buddhist modernism, but Buddhism today more generally, even if we don't like the term Buddhist modernism, is a Buddhism that has transcended national barriers now. Buddhism isn't just a close network, a sangha existing in one community. It's all over the internet. You can connect with Buddhists from all around the world, but that means there's a lot of different traditions going in what we call modern Buddhism. You've also got things like Buddhist tourism emerging. I mentioned Bodh Gaya earlier. People go to visit Bodh Gaya. That's bringing in revenue for Buddhist monks who work in Bodh Gaya. Jobs are created through Buddhist tourism. We've got virtual Buddhism. So that could be attending seminars online from across the world, meditation classes. I don't know how many of you out there have gone onto YouTube and done a guided meditation. That's virtual Buddhism. And the other thing we've also found from this is that we've got this trend of secular Buddhism. So secular Buddhism being Buddhism that doesn't need a belief in necessarily Buddha himself or nirvana. It's just about, it's those people who, I meditate because it helps me get through my day. Rather than meditating to achieve enlightenment, you're just doing it without the religious aspect.
Well, I think that's the same with, say, mindfulness colouring books. A lot of people wouldn't actually associate that with Buddhism. It's just a helpful thing for them, or it's part of their meditation, it's part of, calming them down.
Yeah, so exactly. So we've got all of these different practices that kind of are part of secular Buddhism, but they're almost so secular you don't even realise they have Buddhist roots anymore. And a person who talks about this quite a lot is Stephen Batchelor, who I know is on a couple of syllabuses. And one of the things that he highlights about secular Buddhism is that it's about praxis, it's about doing something over beliefs. So it's about Buddhism encouraging you to help the world rather than, what you think about when you meditate, or try not to think about when you meditate, or so on. So secular Buddhism, is also tied in with the Green Movement. We've got 2 different podcasts on Buddhism and environmentalism. And a lot of the top environmentalist Buddhists today might also be considered as secular Buddhists, because their whole way of teaching, their whole way of acting is based on practice. It's about how can we help the world now, rather than I'm going to sit and meditate to achieve nirvana. Now, this type of Buddhism is not without its criticisms. And one really interesting book that has only been released in the last couple of months is Evan Thompson's Why I Am Not a Buddhist. Now, Evan Thompson is an academic in the Buddhist field, and he has worked with many top Buddhist scholars over the years. He's attended Mind and Life conferences, which are a large conference every year where the Dalai Lama comes into contact with contemporary scientists and they have discussions about how similar Buddhism and science are, we'll go into that next podcast. But Evan Thompson argues in this book that this whole secular Buddhism, Buddhist modernism thing often means that what people are doing isn't Buddhism at all, because it loses its meaning outside of its traditional frameworks. You know, what are the three jewels? Well, one of them is the Sangha. That's the community of Buddhists. How many people today say that they are practicing Buddhists without a Sangha around them?
I mean, possibly not even knowing what a Sangha is.
Exactly. So his critique is that how can something be called Buddhism if we're not even adhering to three principles? You know, okay, we can keep a belief in the Buddha, but the Sangha, is that not a really important part of Buddhism? And does Buddhism lose something? You know, I specialize in Mahayana Buddhism, and some of the beautiful images we have in Mahayana literature has been completely wiped out by Western Buddhism. And it's like, oh no, but that's not the scientific bit. That doesn't fit with, you know, secular society. And so we kind of, as an audience, ignore it. And so he argues that maybe that means that what we're talking about isn't even Buddhism at all. And so then we can start questioning whether Buddhist modernism is even a thing. Has Buddhism developed so far that it's no longer Buddhism? I mean, I'm quite sympathetic to Thompson's argument here. I feel like a lot of the things that he talks about in his book, I've experienced through studying Buddhism and meeting various Buddhist practitioners over the years. However, there is a counterpoint to this, which is Buddhism has always changed for its environment. You know, it started in ancient India. Today, Buddhism doesn't feature that much in Indian society. It moved to China, there where it adapted along with, you know, Taoism, Confucianism. It moved to Japan, where it adapted with Shinto beliefs and became, you know, Zen Buddhism. Buddhism has always changed. It's never been static. And so to say that Western Buddhism isn't Buddhism kind of undermines the message or what's happened historically. Also, it undermines the Buddhist principle that everything's always changing. There is no self, there is no Buddhism. You can apply anatta to Buddhism itself. We can't say that one Buddhism is the true Buddhism.
That would be attachment, which...
Yeah, you'd be causing attachment. It would be saying that one fixed form of Buddhism exists, and therefore, does that apply to the self then? Like, so there are knock-on implications. So it's a difficult debate, but it's one worth thinking about. So, before we finish, I'm just going to run through a couple of what I think are pros and cons of modern Buddhism. So the first of these is that the pros is that Buddhism has become more easily accessible. That's great. It's doing a lot of good in the world, environmentally, for, you know, the rise in awareness of mental health. Buddhism is doing a lot for those type of groups. So it being more easily accessible because it's on the internet, etc., is great. The doctrine has become more rational and philosophical to suit contemporary seekers. Again, this means that more people are talking about Buddhism. You know, think how bad the world would be, or how much worse off the world would be if Buddhism had died out in the 1600s, 1700s, and not become part of the Enlightenment movement in the West. You know, the world, I think, would be worse off if it hadn't adapted, although, you know, there are questions around that. And tied in with that is that, you know, Buddhism or Buddhist practitioners are now working really closely with psychologists and understanding the field of psychotherapy, because Buddhism has been talking about the mind for far longer than Western science. So there are areas in which it can really offer the West, you know, some really interesting insights that, although might not be classed as scientific, can help us understand humanity better. Also, it's, you know, fitting in with the theme of Western capitalism, Buddhism has undergone an internalization, and that's where we don't need an authority outside of us. We ourselves have become our own authority, and that's quite a nice thought. It can be quite empowering. I'm in control of my breath, I'm in control of my day, and so on. And it's this worldly outlook has meant that it's gone on to reach fields of environmentalism, which again is doing some fantastic work. I talked in previous podcasts about the notion of eco-sattvas and people using Buddhist principles in order to try and preserve the planet. So it's very difficult to argue that that's not a good thing. And its links with science and technology mean that it's constantly updating itself. Buddhism is constantly having to, or Buddhist practitioners are constantly having to rethink their ideas and keeps the tradition fresh and up to date with modern developments. The cons. All of this means that Buddhism has lost a lot of its traditional methods of learning. We go back to ancient India and there's a lot of like repetition of stories, and the Sangha, and a lot of the traditional ways in which Buddhism was learnt, student-teacher lineages. It's not to say it's gone completely, but in, popular Western Buddhism, that's kind of disappeared. And, maybe there was more from that type of learning that we could have got out of it than just searching on the internet. We've also lost, like, the experience of ritual participation. Okay, a lot of people will still go on retreats and kind of glimpse that, but you could be paying thousands of pounds to go on a 4-day retreat in a Buddhist centre rather than just that being your local group. And that, shared ritual participation is something that we find across all religions. It's something that we as humans need and want, whether, subconsciously it's part of our DNA, I would argue. And we've kind of like lost that now. The whole cyber Sangha thing is great in a lot of ways, especially, when we've been in lockdown. It means that people can continue to practice and communicate with their groups, but being at a ritual and being involved, there's something tangible about it that has become lost in Buddhism. We've also lost the knowledge of, exclusive Buddhist languages. So languages like Sanskrit and Pali are dying out, and it's now very hard, and Katie will attest to this, to find teachers of those languages today in the UK in particular. And these are languages that the original texts were written in. So maybe there's more we could be getting out of Buddhism if we could read the original texts as they were meant to be read and understood.
So for context, part of my PhD is translating Sanskrit into English, and I wish I could understand it truly in the Sanskrit without having to translate it into English, because there's so many multiple meanings to words. Like, so much is lost just by that translation.
Yeah. And another thing that's lost is this idea of renunciation. Renunciation doesn't really fit in with a capitalist culture. The idea is that we should all be working and producing to help the economy, to boost it, and it's a cycle from there. And so the ideal of renunciation has kind of been lost from Western Buddhism. It's now something you do in the mornings, at night, or maybe go for a retreat for a weekend. It's not something that you live all day, every day.
For the rest of your life.
Yeah, for a majority of people. And the final one, and I think it's kind of ironic because I'm sat here trying to teach you about all this Buddhism. One of the main problems with contemporary Buddhism is the standardization of doctrine. So that's like where Buddhism has become textbook Buddhism. So, I know for a lot of people's courses, we learn about the difference between Mahayana Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism. But there's actually a lot more nuance to that relationship, like in actuality. But Buddhism kind of gets diluted down, understandably, because you've got to fit it into a 2-year course. But it does cause these understandings of Buddhism that they're not necessarily wrong, but there is a lot more nuance to those arguments that you just simply can't get through in a school environment or even in a university environment. Sometimes, you have to kind of be like, but Buddhists believe this, and Mahayana Buddhists believe this.
You have to generalise to an extent, even if it's just so you can actually express an argument concisely in an exam. There's some generalisation that goes on.
Exactly, and that's, it's just part of it, but I think it's something that we should be aware of is happening when we come to understand Buddhism today, and particularly for the purpose of text talks, when it's for teachers and pupils, realizing that that standardization process has gone into that textbook that you may be reading from, and maybe that there's more out there, and to question it, to start thinking more actively about, well, what do we mean by Mahayana Buddhists believe this? Like, do Zen Buddhists believe this? Do Tibetan Buddhists believe this? Does Buddhism in China? Like, you can really dissect it down, especially the Mahayana tradition is one that is so vast that tends to get squished all together. But yeah, so that is a brief-ish, podcast on Buddhism in the West.
That's great, thank you, and definitely a lot to think about. And the way you've given us pros and cons is so helpful for exams, because I know counter arguments are an important part of exams. But yeah, as you've shown to us there, thinking a little bit beyond that, thinking about the context we're really talking in, is really important. So thank you, Alex. If you want to ask us any questions or any comments at all, get in touch with us. You can message us on Facebook at Text Talks or on Twitter at Text Talks 1.
Thank you very much. See you next week.